So picture this, a young actress beats out four other women, including an Oscar-nominated star, for the role of a lifetime. She wins the part, she lands the franchise, she marries the lead actor years later, and the movie that was supposed to launch her into superhero stardom becomes one of the biggest punchlines in Hollywood history. That's Blake Lively. And that's Green Lantern. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. This wasn't just a bad movie that came and went. This was a decision that quietly shaped the next decade of her career, pushed her into a temporary retreat from acting altogether, and ironically set the stage for the exact moment she met the man she'd eventually marry. So how did the role she fought so hard to get become the role everyone wishes she'd never taken? And why, more than a decade later, is this movie still getting referenced by other films as a punchline? Let's go back to the beginning. It's 2009. Blake Lively is 22 years old. She's known mostly for one thing, Serena van der Woodsen on Gossip Girl. Glamorous, recognizable, but not exactly taken seriously as a film actress yet. She'd had a small, early role in The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants years earlier, and she just earned real critical praise for her supporting turn in Ben Affleck's The Town. That role mattered because it suggested she could be more than a CW star. But suggesting isn't proving. And in Hollywood, that's a dangerous place to sit. You're famous enough to get auditions, not famous enough to get cast without a fight. So when Warner Brothers starts casting their big budget superhero tentpole, Green Lantern, Lively wants in, and she's not the obvious choice, not even close. The studio is looking for someone to play Carol Ferris, the love interest opposite Ryan Reynolds' Hal Jordan. And the list of actresses being considered reads like an award season ballot. Eva Green, Jennifer Garner, Diane Kruger, Kerry Russell. These are proven, respected, bankable names. Lively is the 22-year-old CW star trying to break into blockbuster films. At first, that didn't seem like it mattered much until she walked into the audition room. Because what happens next is the first real turning point in this story. Lively doesn't just audition, she goes all in. Multiple reports from the time describe her outworking more experienced actresses for the part, treating the audition less like a tryout and more like a campaign. And it works. She gets the role, she beats Eva Green, she beats Jennifer Garner, she beats Diane Kruger. On paper, that's a victory. A star on the rise, landing a $100 million franchise over actresses, twice her resume. It should have been the beginning of something huge. Instead, it became the beginning of one of the most infamous box office disasters of the decade. That becomes important later. Remember that. Let's talk about why everyone still talks about this movie more than a decade later. Because Green Lantern wasn't just a flop. It became shorthand, like a cultural reference point for how not to make a superhero movie. Years later, when Ryan Reynolds himself made Deadpool 2, the film actually included a joke where his character kills off a past version of himself. The one who approved the script for Green Lantern. Even Reynolds has used it as the punchline to his own career. And when Sonic the Hedgehog 3 came out, it took its own jab at the film too. That's the kind of reputation that doesn't fade. It calcifies into a running joke the industry keeps coming back to. And for the actors attached to it, especially the ones still building their names, that's not just embarrassing, it's a career risk. Reynolds himself wasn't a complete stranger to comic book disappointments by the time Green Lantern came along, which makes the whole story feel even more layered in hindsight. He'd played a mostly mutilated version of Deadpool in X-Men Origins Wolverine 2 years earlier, a take on the character that fans loathed and that Reynolds himself would later joke about for years. Before that, there was Blade Trinity, another comic book role that came and went without much critical love. So when Warner Brothers cast him as Hal Jordan, it wasn't really a case of a proven action star walking into a sure thing. It was a charismatic but still unproven leading man, paired with a rising but unproven actress, both trying to use the same movie to prove they belonged at the top of the industry. When the film failed, it didn't just damage one career trajectory, it temporarily put a question mark over both of theirs at the same time, which is part of why the years immediately afterward were genuinely uncertain for each of them professionally, long before either knew how the next decade would actually play out. So now let's go back to 2011, when the movie actually hits theaters. The expectations were enormous. Warner Brothers was clearly trying to replicate what Marvel had started doing with its cinematic universe, building an interconnected world of heroes audiences would follow for years. Green Lantern was supposed to be DC's foothold into that kind of franchise filmmaking. A budget reported at around $200 million, with some accounts placing the true production cost closer to $225 once everything was factored in. A built-in comic book fan base. A charismatic lead in Ryan Reynolds, fresh off the box office success of The Proposal. A supporting cast stacked with respected names: Peter Sarsgaard, Mark Strong, Angela Bassett, Tim Robbins. On paper, it had everything. Then it actually came out. Critics tore into it almost immediately. The film currently sits at roughly 26% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the critical consensus summarized it as a noisy, overproduced film that wasted both its budget and decades of comic book mythology. Audiences weren't dramatically kinder, landing the film around 45% on the same scale. But here's where it gets stranger. The complaints weren't really about one thing going wrong. They were about almost everything going wrong at once. Start with the suit. The Green Lantern costume in the comics is iconic, but the studio made the decision to render it entirely with computer graphics instead of building a practical costume. The result looked synthetic and oddly weightless on screen, and it became one of the most mocked visual choices in any superhero film of that era. A decision later filmmakers would specifically avoid repeating. Then there's the script. Critics described it as disjointed and thin, trying to cram in years of comic book lore, the origin of the core, the mythology of the rings, multiple villains, a sprawling alien world called OA, into a single 2-hour movie that hadn't earned the right to ask audiences to care about any of it yet. The film was so busy building a universe that it forgot to build a story. And then there's Lively's role specifically. Several critics pointed out that Carol Ferris was left thin on the page, present mostly to react, to worry, to wait on the sidelines while the spectacle happened around her. It wasn't that her performance was singled out as the problem, it was that the character barely had a problem to perform. Here's where the timing got even worse. The summer of 2011 was already saturated with superhero movies. X-Men First Class had come out a month earlier. Thor had released that spring. Captain America, the first Avenger, was about to follow just weeks later. On top of that, Warner Brothers was trying to launch this new, separate cinematic universe in the same stretch of years where Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, a completely different tone, a completely different DC universe, was still fresh in audiences' minds. Asking moviegoers to embrace a lighter, cosmic, CGI-heavy DC property right next to that legacy was always going to be a hard sell. Green Lantern walked into the most competitive superhero summer in box office history and didn't have the script or the execution to stand out in it. It's worth pausing on just how long Warner Brothers had been trying to make this exact movie happen, because it adds another layer to why the eventual failure stung so much. The studio had been attempting to bring Green Lantern to the screen for more than 2 decades before it finally got made, cycling through different directions over the years, at one point reportedly developing a much more comedic take with Jack Black attached. Those plans changed once Marvel's Iron Man hit in 2008 and proved that a single charismatic lead and a lighter tone could anchor a billion-dollar franchise. Warner Brothers recalibrated toward a more straightforwardly dramatic, mythology-heavy take instead, hoping it could do for DC what Iron Man had just done for Marvel. That's an important piece of context because it means Green Lantern wasn't just one movie that happened to fail, it was the test case for an entire strategy. The film meant to prove DC could build a connected cinematic universe the way Marvel was already doing. When it collapsed, it didn't just take down one franchise. It delayed Warner Brothers' broader universe-building ambitions by years, well before what eventually became the DC Extended Universe took shape with Man of Steel 2 years later. Even behind the scenes, the picture wasn't smooth. Reports at the time described tension between Reynolds and director Martin Campbell, with some accounts suggesting Campbell hadn't wanted Reynolds in the lead role at all and was essentially overruled by the studio. Years later, Reynolds himself was candid about what he felt actually went wrong, telling Variety that the production had too many people spending too much money, and that whenever a problem came up, the response was always to throw more visual effects at it instead of stopping to fix the character work underneath. According to him, that fundamental rethink never happened. The studio kept building spectacle on a foundation that was never stable to begin with. Here's where it gets even stranger, though. This wasn't a movie that just disappointed, it became a financial disaster. Against that roughly $200 million production budget, plus tens of millions more in marketing, the film grossed only around $220 to $237 million worldwide, depending on which tally you use. That might sound close to breaking even until you remember how studio economics actually work. Between production costs, marketing spend, and the cut theaters take, a film generally needs to gross 2 to 3 times its budget just to turn a real profit. Some reports at the time estimated Green Lantern needed to approach $500 million worldwide to be considered financially solid. It came nowhere close. Some estimates placed Warner Brothers' losses on the project at tens of millions of dollars once everything was accounted for. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Despite a screenwriting team already being hired a year earlier to develop a sequel, and despite the film ending with a post-credits tease setting up the classic villain, Sinestro, Warner Brothers quietly scrapped those plans entirely. A franchise that was supposed to run for years, and that was meant to help kickstart an entire connected DC universe to rival Marvel's, ended after a single film. For an actor, being part of a movie that flops is one thing. Being part of a movie that kills its own franchise and delays an entire studio's universe-building strategy on arrival is something else entirely. Because now your name is permanently attached to the cautionary tale. But that's only the surface of why this mattered for Lively specifically. Let's talk about timing, because timing is everything in this story. Lively didn't just take this role at a random point in her career. She took it at the exact moment she was trying to transition from television star to legitimate film actress. That transition is one of the hardest moves in Hollywood. Audiences and casting directors alike tend to box performers into the medium that made them famous. A failed first major film role doesn't just hurt the box office numbers. It reinforces the doubt that you were already fighting against. It gives critics a built-in narrative. She's a TV actress who couldn't carry a movie, and the part that doesn't usually make it into the highlight reel of this story is what happened right after. The films Lively took on in the years immediately following Green Lantern. Bigger ensemble dramas, smaller passion projects. Reverse the narrative either. By around 2012, she stepped away from acting almost entirely for a stretch, choosing instead to launch a lifestyle and e-commerce brand called Preserve. It's easy to read that now as just a side project. At the time, it looked a lot more like an exit. The brand folded within roughly a year, and Lively quietly returned to acting afterward. That's the quiet cost that doesn't show up in box office reports. It's reputational. And for a moment, it was almost career-ending. Reputations in Hollywood are sticky, and so is doubt. So why didn't this end her film career permanently? Here's the part that makes this story more complicated than a simple cautionary tale. Because the same film that became a punchline also put her directly across from Ryan Reynolds, repeatedly for months on set. And while the professional outcome of Green Lantern was a disaster, the personal outcome ended up reshaping both of their lives. The two would go on to marry in 2012 and build one of the most publicly visible and commercially powerful celebrity partnerships in modern Hollywood, one that today spans films, business ventures, and a media presence that dwarfs anything either of them had individually back in 2011. Reynolds has been open that he doesn't look back on making Green Lantern as a positive experience overall, but has acknowledged the one undeniable exception. It's where he met his future wife. That's not a detail people usually connect to the failure of the movie, but it's there. The worst career decision of her early filmography is also, indirectly, the origin point of the relationship that would go on to define the next chapter of her public life. Let's zoom out for a second, though, because this isn't really just a story about one actress and one bad movie. It's a story about how Hollywood evaluates risk and how unevenly that risk falls on different kinds of stars. When an established A-lister takes a swing on a big franchise and it fails, the industry tends to treat it as a forgivable misstep, a known commodity who had one rough outing. But when a rising star, especially one trying to escape a TV actress label, attaches themselves to a flop of that size, the consequences tend to stick harder and longer. Reynolds himself is the other half of that comparison. He'd already had rocky comic book outings before this, a muted version of Deadpool in X-Men Origins Wolverine, a critically panned turn in Blade Trinity and Praise and Green Lantern became one more entry on that list. For a few years afterward, when two more of his films bombed on the same weekend in 2013, there was real industry skepticism about whether he could ever headline a successful blockbuster again. It took years and a complete reinvention through Deadpool for that narrative to flip entirely. The same failure gets read completely differently depending on who's standing next to it and how long their career runway is to recover. That's the part of this story that says less about any one actor and more about how the industry quietly assigns blame and patience unevenly. And it explains why, for years afterward, entertainment outlets kept returning to Green Lantern whenever they wrote about either of their careers. Not necessarily because the film was unusually bad by Hollywood standards, but because it became the easiest narrative hook, the flop that almost derailed everything, the mistake before the comeback. Because here's the actual ending to this story, and it's the part that flips the entire narrative on its head. Lively didn't disappear after Green Lantern. After her brief detour into building a lifestyle brand, she came back, and within a few years, she was headlining projects specifically built around her ability to carry a film on her own. The Age of Adeline, The Shallows, and A Simple Favor among them. Those are the exact kind of leading roles that critics, just a few years earlier, had implied she might not be capable of holding together. It wasn't a perfectly straight comeback story either. In 2020, she headlined The Rhythm Section, a spy thriller that got a tepid critical reception and became its own significant box office disappointment, pulled from thousands of theaters within weeks. Although the start of the COVID-19 pandemic that same month almost certainly compounded that particular outcome beyond anyone's control. Careers in this industry rarely move in one clean direction. They zigzag. Meanwhile, on the studio side, the lesson of Green Lantern didn't fully stick either. More than a decade later, in 2023, Warner Brothers released The Flash, another attempt to adapt a beloved DC character with a troubled production, similar CGI criticism, and a nearly identical opening weekend gross to Green Lantern, down to releasing almost exactly 12 years apart on the calendar. History has a way of rhyming in this industry, especially when the underlying incentives never really change. DC's cinematic universe has since been rebooted again under new creative leadership, with its own version of the Green Lanterns now being introduced through projects like the upcoming Lanterns series, a sign that the studio still believes in the character, even if it took more than a decade to try again. So what does this story actually teach us? Not that one flop ends a career, it's that early failures get remembered very differently depending on how the story ends. If Lively's film career had stalled out completely after 2011, Green Lantern would be remembered as the obvious warning sign everyone should have seen coming. Instead, because she kept working even after a real detour away from the industry and kept landing roles that proved the opposite point, the same movie became something closer to a footnote, a remember when instead of a turning point. That's the real lesson buried in this story. Hollywood doesn't just judge talent, it judges narratives. And the narrative around a single decision can completely change meaning depending on everything that happens afterward, sometimes years afterward, and sometimes because of a relationship nobody saw coming on set. The sequel never got made. The reviews never got better with age. The film is still, to this day, a punchline other movies reach for. But the actress at the center of what was supposed to be a franchise-killing mistake ended up building exactly the career that mistake was supposed to prevent. There's one more layer to this story worth sitting with, because it says something about how audiences and critics don't always agree, and how that disagreement shapes a film's legacy long after release. Despite the brutal critical consensus, Green Lantern actually opened reasonably well. It had a strong opening weekend at the box office before the reviews and word of mouth caught up with it, and the numbers fell off a cliff in the weeks that followed. That's a pattern worth noticing, because it tells you the film wasn't rejected outright by a mass audience on day one. It was buried gradually as the conversation around it soured. And if you actually go looking through audience reviews from the years since, you'll find a surprising amount of pushback against the critical pile-on. Some viewers argue the film got compared unfairly to Thor and X-Men First Class. 2v0 to Max Mouse, two movies that released the same summer and had the benefit of years of careful franchise building behind them. Others point out that the visual effects on the planet OA, whatever their flaws, were ambitious for 2011, and that Reynolds' performance, fast-talking, a little cocky, clearly having fun, was already showing flashes of the comedic timing that would later make him a global star as Deadpool. It's a strange kind of legacy. A film simultaneously remembered as a disaster and by a smaller but vocal group of viewers as underrated. That tension matters because it's part of why this story doesn't fit neatly into a simple "she made a mistake" framing. The mistake wasn't necessarily the audition or even taking the role. Lively did exactly what a rising star is supposed to do. She fought for a bigger opportunity and won it over far more established names. The mistake, if there even was one single mistake, belonged more to the studio. An unfinished script, a costume decision that didn't hold up, a release date wedged into the most competitive superhero summer in box office history, and a production that, by Reynolds' own later admission, kept throwing money at visual problems instead of stopping to fix the story underneath them. Lively was a 22-year-old actress, standing in the middle of a much bigger structural failure, and she absorbed a disproportionate amount of the reputational fallout simply because she was the one still trying to prove she belonged in film in the first place. That's worth remembering the next time a young actor or actress takes a swing on a massive franchise role and it doesn't work out. The headlines almost always frame it as their mistake. The truth, more often than not, is a lot more complicated. A Tanger konsar konsensariden datings in a rendenger konsaridairkul of studio decisions, release timing, budget mismanagement, and a dozen factors that have nothing to do with whoever happens to be standing in front of the camera when the lights go up and the reviews come in. So, yes, when people ask what Blake Lively's biggest career mistake was, Green Lantern is usually the answer that comes up first. But maybe the more accurate way to put it is this. It was the role that nearly broke her transition into film, briefly pushed her out of acting altogether, and somehow, almost by accident, gave her the relationship that would go on to define the next chapter of her life. Hollywood rarely hands you a story that clean. This one came close. And maybe that's the part worth remembering more than the flop itself. Not how badly something failed, but what someone does with their career after everyone assumes it's over.